Today we'll talk about checks and balances, an important principle underlying our Constitution and designed to keep government from becoming too strong. Each branch checks the other branch. It checks, and because of the legislative branch being considered the most powerful branch, there are checks within that branch itself, where each body must pass a law in identical form. So we talked about shared powers, but today we're talking not just about shared powers, but overlapping powers, where each branch is given some part of the other branch's power to limit it. It's to keep an individual branch of government from becoming too strong and to prevent the entire government becoming too powerful over the people, which was, you recall, was one of the concerns of the founders. A few examples we'll go through. The president is a commander-in-chief, which means the president can order troops, can direct war, can move ships and troops across the world. But the Congress has the power to declare war, and the Congress must appropriate funds for war. So when we get into prolonged and unpopular wars, we get the Congress who's hearing from the people that want to limit how long the war goes on, perhaps ordering a timetable, cutting back on funds, and trying to limit the president in that regard. And that's a very good example of where the checks and balances were intended to work. Another example is legislation. Each chamber must pass a law in identical form. The president must sign the legislation or can veto the legislation. And when the president vetoes the legislation, it's returned to the Congress, and the Congress can override the veto. But in order to do that, it needs 2/3 vote in both chambers, a high barrier, but nonetheless a check on the president, who is in turn a check on the Congress. So that's a very good example of how the checks and balances work. Another example is presidents can make appointments, but the Senate is required to approve those appointments. The president can make treaties, but they require 2/3 vote of the Senate. Now notice here we're not talking about the House. This is the power given only to the Senate to approve presidential appointments and to approve treaties. Now presidents use their executive powers to make executive agreements, which are agreements between other countries that don't have the same binding as a treaty, but also don't need to be going to the Congress for approval. So that's a case where the president's stretching the powers a little bit in foreign relations. Another good example is presidential impeachment. Here, a president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. But here we see the ambiguity again. What high crimes and misdemeanors are is debated each time there's a presidential impeachment or impeachment of a judge. Presidents can be impeached by the House by a simple majority, as President Clinton was impeached, and then they're tried by the Senate. But here it takes 2/3 votes. The House makes the case before the Senate, much like a prosecutor. They're tried in the Senate, and the Chief Justice comes over to preside. So there you have all three branches involved checking, because removing a president is an ultimate power of the Congress, and it can't be done easily. Judiciary is the judges have lifetime appointments to protect them from interference. But in a very clever provision, the founders said you can't reduce their pay while they're in service. So while you can have a lifetime, if the Congress could reduce your pay, that would be a form of punishment. So they check that. Judicial decisions can be overturned by the Congress if they don't reach an issue of the Constitution. If they're just a new law, then the Congress can pass a new law. So even though the courts can rule things illegal, they could be corrected if it's not a constitutional issue. If it's an issue speaking to the Constitution, saying that this is an issue of free speech, equal protection of the laws, then there's not much that the Congress can do. There have been very important judicial decisions, such as the U.S. versus Nixon, which ordered President Nixon to turn over his tapes to the special prosecutor that were used in his impeachment. So here's a case where the courts are involved in interpreting the powers of another branch. Other examples, such as line item veto, where the Congress gave the president the power to veto individual provisions of a bill, and the court ruled that to be unconstitutional. So the Constitution is a living document. Each branch stretches the limits as they seek to gain more power, and new conflicts will always occur, and the courts will step in to settle those conflicts and rule something unconstitutional, or say the president is out of bounds or the Congress is out of bounds, and that keeps the system in check. So checks and balances, very important component of our system. So the next time we'll talk about another principle that was used in forming our government, that of federalism, our shared powers between the state and national government.